Hello, and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Annmarie Hylton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. In this episode, we're focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, for 2030 and where the world stands in achieving them. The SDGs are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. The 17 goals, along with 169 targets, were adopted by the United Nations member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 17 goals cover a wide range of issues, including poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, climate change, and sustainable development. The SDGs are based on the principles of leaving nobody behind and promoting sustainable development that balances economic, social, and environmental dimensions. The SDGs were intended to be implemented by all countries, both developed and developing, working in global partnership. The SDGs are intended to be achieved by 2030. Today, I have esteemed guest, Katarina Tully, known as Cat Tully, who's the founder of the School of International Futures, or SOIF, and from over here. Cat leads the School of International Futures, a not-for-profit international collective of practitioners based in the UK who use future thinking to inspire change at the local, national, and global levels. SOIF has worked with organizations like the UN, Omniar, NATO, the Royal Society, and national governments to make the world fairer for current and future generations. SOIF also supports a growing network of next-generation Foresight practitioners. Previously, Kat served as Strategy Project Director at the UK Foreign Office and as Policy Advisor in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. She is a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Government Accountability Office Center for Strategic Foresight and a member of the Advisory Committee for the Chilean Council of Foresight and Strategy. Kat's mission is to inspire individuals, communities, organizations, and governments to reinvigorate democracy by designing, scaling, and embedding a range of innovations incorporating thinking about the future. Let's get into the interview. It's 2015, and the year has started off running with shocking speeds of change to policies, wars, humanitarian aid, environmental tragedies. We need to face reality now and decide who and what we want to be in the future on this planet. After our youth, most of us know that time passes by quickly, and before you know it, years have gone by and you're left wondering what happened. Although many plans have been put in place for the future through the SDGs for 2030, only about less than 16% are progressing. The 17 goals are 1, no poverty, 2, zero hunger, 3, good health and well-being, 4, quality education, 5, gender equality, 6, clean water and sanitation, 7, affordable and clean energy, 8, decent work and economic growth, 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, 10, reduced inequalities, 11, sustainable cities and communities, 12, responsible consumption and production, 13, climate action, 14, life below water, 15, life on land, 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and 17, partnerships for the goals. Cat Tully's organization works to put strategy to all of this chaos so that organizations, governments, and people can achieve what they need to for a better world. Her work applies deep understanding of futures, people, and systems, something we need more now than ever. Welcome, Cat.
Hi, Annmarie. It's such a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm so excited about this discussion because, as I just said, we need this more now than ever.
Oh, yes.
I don't know. I just, the last, I can't believe that it's only the beginning of the year and so much has happened. It's left me just speechless. Not only myself, but just I think a lot of people don't know which direction to run, what to think. Um, you know, it's a shocker.
Yes, it certainly feels that we are at a crossroads, and some very serious changes are happening in the next year.
Yes, and so, before we dive deep into the chaos that we find ourselves in, I always like to find out a little bit of personal information about the person that I interview. And so I wanted to know, with all of the work and, projects that you've been part of, what is it that you have found, I guess, that, drives you or, inspires you to continue?
That's a great question. I think that of the work that we do, when I look at the array of people that we work with, the countries that we're engaging in, the thing that inspires me is the next generation Foresight practitioner community that started 8 years ago and now has about over 1,000 people from 100 countries. And they're all, I love the word that you use, change makers. They're all change makers playing with time, using strategic foresight to drive change in their societies, in their communities, in their governments, whether it's Namatai in Zimbabwe advocating for the next generation in her community, or whether it's Amara in Sri Lanka, looking at how you engage across different religious groups, all the way through to Raya in the UAE, who's just started this new School of Humanity, which is an online school, high school, teaching kids the kind of skills that you really need for the 21st century. So it's that kind of, if you like, force multiplier role that we have, where it's the work that people in the community and networks that we run and how they've been able to use foresight to find a power base from which to kind of really influence and drive change. So that, I think, is the thing that makes me most excited and most hopeful in otherwise what can feel quite a grim and overwhelmingly difficult time.
Yes, I love that you I guess I would say I was thinking about, I guess, planting a seed in people and being able to see it, grow or maybe even like transform into something, that becomes, I guess, more than they expected. Um,
Absolutely. And at the moment that we're in, where there's a lot of destruction of knowledge, a lot of destruction of organizations and of relationships, um, that concept of being really clear about what are the seeds that one wants to protect and where to put them. So when the land is more fertile and the conditions are better, that key things that we hold and know now can then flourish in the future is, I think, a really, really helpful analogy, and actually helps you understand why future thinking, which often people think is being like, oh, tell me about scenarios in 2050, might help actually bring to life why futures thinking is so important, literally in the here and the now, often when we feel that the house is on fire.
Yes, and I was thinking of 2 questions at once, but I think for the audience, maybe we have to explain, I guess, what is futures thinking and foresight thinking, so that they understand, because I think, when people always like, just sort of what you mentioned, to think about the future, they're always thinking like a crystal ball or like somebody that's, or a Notre Dameist or something of that sort. And so, I guess explain what is it? Mhm.
Yes. Well, what it isn't is prediction. We are absolutely not saying that you can actually say now what is going to happen. And it's also pretty much unhelpful to put probabilities around what you think is going to happen. But in a world where things are uncertain, where generations have got very different values, where demography is changing, where geopolitics and emerging technology is changing the world in which we're in, often very, very quickly, it is very helpful to go, well, actually, next year, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, it's not going to be the same as today. So when we're making decisions, let's have a systematic way of exploring how though those different futures might look like. So what you're often doing is understanding the drivers of change. You're often understanding and questioning your assumptions about what might happen. And what you're often doing is putting alternative views of the future on the table so you can kind of stress test and be resilient for alternative possibilities. So again, one of the, as well as being asked whether you've got a crystal ball, one of the misapprehensions people often have is that, that the future is about foresight is actually about the future. It's actually not. It's about reframing what is possible today, and in particular, opening up new possibilities by asking what ifs and really questioning some of those assumptions that we take for granted. So that's the field that we work with, and it's often at three levels. It's a mindset. So thinking about how the future might change is something that you can do as an individual. It's what we do when we buy a house or start planning in our organizations for the future, or if we come together and discuss what might, what's going to be the kind of jobs that your children will have in the future. These are all things that we do naturally, but futures literacy as an individual can be quite helpful to think, well, actually, let's be a little bit more systematic about how we look for signals of change in the future and do that. You also can do futures and foresight at the project or intervention level. So you come together to, for example, say, well, what's the kind of context of the US that change makers who are progressives looking to drive change around social justice and racial equality, what are the different scenarios that might be playing out over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years? Yes, of course, the most immediate thing on our minds are the political, changing political context, but climate change, emerging technology, that's all going to play as well. So let's be prepared and think about those possibilities and do so together, so we can share our knowledge and perhaps orientate ourselves to being able to build capabilities and plans that are a little bit more resilient to the future, as well as shape where we can. But then you also have futures and foresight at the kind of systemic level, where we can come together and go, well, what is the futures that we want to create together, and how do we make sure that we move towards that as a society? So those are the three things that we work on, and I hope that gives you a little bit of a pocket introduction to futures and foresight.
Yes, I was since I think in pictures, I was thinking of because of where we find ourselves, I was thinking that futures and foresight is like preparing your backpack for climbing the Himalayas. And planning out your trip and having enough food, preparing for if somebody's going to injured, if somebody says I don't, your walking partner says I don't want to walk anymore, being able to continue so you can keep going, plan for whatever weather conditions, so wait, you don't die or something, having the right boots. And then also preparing for the good things, like having the right camera so you can say, look, we made it. So
Absolutely.
that's if I were going to give a visual interpretation to what you do, that's what I would say that it is. And I'm picking the Himalayas on purpose because it's something that lots of people want to do, but probably it's not for everybody, and can be terrifying to get to the top.
Well, I think that's a lovely
Mhm.
analogy. It is definitely, it's the journey analogy is really good, because like you often know where you want to go to, but like that you need to be prepared for it, and you need to know that actually things are going to shift on the way. You might accidentally take the wrong journey, or there may be storms. And so being able to kind of shift and actually still go to where you want to go, but actually respond to changing environment. Yes, that's exactly what this area of work helps you do.
Yes, and so, and speaking of shifts, so originally when we start talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, they were developed in 2015, and when we go back and look, 10 years ago, life was quite different, which is expected. Time changes things. But even, I would say, maybe we were very hopeful because of I guess how people were thinking back in 2015. I guess we a plan was created, but I guess I'll just ask the obvious question: is this plan realistic anymore?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think the vision is still relevant, right? This vision for a desirable future out to 2030, which was intended to be a scaffolding, if you like, around which we can all, in our own ways, kind of coordinate our action to this really quite inspiring global story of the kind of world that we want to all live in, which is a peaceful, fair, sustainable world where we don't leave people behind. And that was an interdependent and universal and an inclusive vision, right? That still remains an aspirational and inspirational vision. The question is, especially after COVID, and especially given the kind of dynamics that we're living through at the moment, it feels as if we're not only far away from it, but moving away from it. So the big question is, do we want to still commit to that kind of vision? Because we're going to have to start globally rethinking what comes after it in 2030. That is, if the UN remains relevant. But as well, it's like, well, what do we think is actually happening at the moment? And is some of the turbulence that we're living through actually a symptom of a moment of change? And that moment of change that we're in at the moment actually provides almost a launch pad and opportunity for driving the kind of radical shifts and change that is going to be actually necessary to achieve that vision. So, yes, I'll leave it there, but it feels as if we're very far indeed. But as a kind of inspirational North Star, it feels more relevant than ever.
Yes, we are, I guess you'd say, in a extremely critical time. But and you brought up one of the issues that I think obviously changed the world, was COVID. But I think COVID, not only because, of course, people were ill, and it is, I'm just going to kind of go a little bit woo woo, but when you're ill, the main focus, of course, is you have to think about yourself and get better. And I think one of the effects of COVID for the people who are, still remaining here on the planet, is that it made people maybe, I guess, more selfish in a way, because they were faced with the possibility of looking at their death. Like, we were all going to die anyways, but then it became very, like, in your face, because millions of people were dropping off of the planet, and sometimes daily, um and so it made people, I think, well, I have to be concerned about me. And perhaps, I guess, the driving factor is that it changed how people maybe think about themselves and society. I don't know. What do you think that was a big, I guess, a factor of, people kind of, their minds changed after COVID?
So I think that's a great observation that you've made, which is that there's mixed messages out there, right? It's like how do you make sense of them? So I would, how I would respond to the kind of the evidence and the signals that you've laid out is that on the one hand, actually, I would say that there's a lot of indicators to say that cohesion, kindness, solidarity actually came to the fore. If you look at the amount of people that actually stayed at home, it was a huge intergenerational kindness. Like, kids who stayed at home, like compromising their education in service of protecting older people. There were incredible acts of kindness at the individual, community, family level, which I think is really inspiring and important to kind of connect to. I do think what kind of explains a lot of the phenomenon that you're very rightly pointing out is that what it showed is that our governing mechanisms were totally out of whack and totally unsuited to kind of address the issues that faced us. So I think that what it showed is, and I think that is an interesting aspect of the moment that we're in, is that the institutional structures, especially our governing processes that were designed since the end of the Second World War, over these past 70 years, have become more and more out of touch with the realities of how we live our life, technology, economic realities, our values. And, they need to be deeply and radically refreshed and changed. And that's I think the question and what COVID has really brought to the fore. And I think the question about the moment that we're in is, is this, we're at a moment of both the old order dying, but also a new order being reborn that can be shaped. And what happens now feels like a really important. This is a year and coming up few years where things are very plastic and where things are very much up for being shaped.
Yes, and in that, I guess, in the shaping of that, I think, especially here, because I'm here in the U.S. and we have I guess you would say it's a conflict of thoughts and generations, right? Because we have in our administration right now, we have somebody is coming from an older times in the US where it was different. It wasn't we didn't have obviously this much technology and I guess I'll make a little bit more fun. Maybe the youth were more controllable back then. Now you can't, you can't tell your kids anything because they'll be like, that's not what Google said. So you're kind of just, out of luck. And so it's, we're facing, a whole different, type of, I guess I would say a whole different type of human than we've known in the past. And so I think, I'm going to make kind of a strange statement. I think it's almost that we have to get to know the new human that is on the planet before we can even make any decisions. Is that something, I guess, that maybe not in the same words, is that something that that has been in projects and discussions that you've been having lately?
I mean, absolutely. The question of intergenerational connection and how apart different generations feel from each other is, I think, a really important question. And actually, it's something that our colleagues across the US, whether it's in Fort Collins, who have set up, I think, the first Future Generations Commissioner in a town in the US, all the way through to Montana, who have really kind of, in their constitutional court, found that environmental actions had to be taken now in order to protect young people, all the way through to the work of Aditi Juneja in Democracy 2076, who's kind of thinking about how she brings together people of all ages, to think about, what might that future look like? And so you've got throughout, I think, at this time where people can feel quite divided and have very different experiences. So there's people who are really leaning in and exploring what are the things ahead and how can we bring different generations together to explore what we might do. There's in California itself, you're saying that you're in California. California 100 was a great program over the past 2 years that was bringing young people, old people together to look at what California will look like in the next 100 years, how to deal with some of the issues around water shortages, labor issues, etc., that are kind of in the post. and what to do about it, and how to kind of start thinking about what might be some of the governance institutions that can help the state and different communities in California be prepared. So there's some really interesting, just as people are identifying that issue that you highlighted so well, they're also leaning in to do really interesting solutions. So that's what also makes me ironically quite optimistic about some of the situations that we're in, and that we're suddenly having space and realizing that we do need to listen to people who have actually been doing quite radically different things for some time, but their solutions need to be lent into. And lots of interesting work indeed, as I said, including well-being economy work across Vermont and Hawaii, some really interesting citizens' assemblies work in New York. CUNY's just starting something up. So some real seeds of pragmatic change of what to actually do and start designing for the future.
Yes, and then the fact that you've mentioned these different regions, I'm going to make the assumption that like regions, obviously, like Hawaii. I have some friends that live out there, and and also over in New York, that even surrounding the plan of an SDG 2030, the goals that affect them are different, and probably if the plan is to be achieved in the next 5 years, that the focus, it's almost this is what I would, I guess, even do, is that the regions that are probably more focused on the different ones, like maybe you say, oh, you're about sustainable cities, because what a city is. It's not something, I guess, that you would not to say, obviously, Hawaii, they have a city, but, they're mostly concerned, I would say, about land, water, and, weather and things like that. And having these people really, I guess, work towards those different areas. And, one of the other things that I didn't mention that you brought up is, it's ironic and not ironic at all at the same time, is the biggest thing about these sustainable goals and everything that is going on is about relationships, and all these you know the very thing that needs to happen to achieve these goals, and then also to stop these divides, whether it be intergenerational, or other aspects. Um, it needs to be, I guess, the the main thing that we need to work on. um,
Absolutely. And
it's
you brought out you brought out two really amazing points there, which is one, that it's the local level that things make sense at, and secondly, it's where relationships their relationships make such a difference to actually whether you can do and take action or not. And I just wanted to build on that, because I think where the SDGs framework can help. I mean, let's face it, all it is a framework and a story, if you like, that is trying to say a few things, which is you can't pick things off individually. You can't hope to address poverty without addressing ecological issues. You can't address gender without looking at actually participation in the workforce. You can't, for example, look at, if you care about maternal health or maternal mortality, and in both various states in the US and in parts of London where I'm sitting at the moment, and obviously lots of parts of the world, maternal mortality is still unacceptably high. Now, do you address that just by taking a health lens or a gender lens? Or do you actually acknowledge that actually one of the best ways of addressing maternal mortality is actually to build much better infrastructures and roads around hospitals so people can get from the villages and outside into care when they need it? So the point is that outcomes and positive outcomes for human beings in the communities that we live are complex and interdependent. You can't just do a whack-a-mole, like do one thing only, because they're interconnected. the SDGs also kind of emphasize that it's actually in our communities, for example, in, as you mentioned, the city planning processes, or in our townships, or at the state level, that actually you can start moving things and start planning in a certain way. And that, I think, brings me to, I think, the most powerful part of the SDG, a framework, and the 2030 Agreement framework that was signed in 2015 that people rarely focus on. So they tend to focus on the 17 goals, but they don't focus on the preamble, which says that this requires us to do things differently, to take a different approach, to actually engage with people and activate their insights and co-create interventions together with civil society, businesses, academics, because that's the only way that you can actually move away from a business as usual approach to actually activating more resources and better ideas to get that kind of leapfrog approach that we need. And that we need to then integrate that into the kind of planning processes and resource allocation processes that you mentioned that we have in Hawaii, in the state of Vermont, for example, in Fort Collins, when you're actually making plans at this kind of city or state level. So I think that's the helpful contribution of the SDGs, is to kind of encourage us when we're doing that kind of work to think about who needs to be in the room and participating in creating those plans, and also making sure that those plans are much more resilient and interconnected.
Now, let me just state an obvious. Do you think, is it okay, I guess, if we, I don't think, I don't know, amazing things can happen any time. But I guess, is it okay if we just move the timeline on the SDG 2030s, or we just, we have a lot of people saying, we're going down, like we're going to, we got 40 harvests, we're kids are spiraling out. Is it okay for us to move the timeline, or do you think if we move the timeline, it's detrimental, or is it just going to be, if we keep moving, I guess, a timeline, then it shows that we're just not serious?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and a very salient question as we start coming towards 2027, which is when the conversations about what's going to replace it as a framework starts. Now, I think there's a question to that, which is like, we need to hold ourselves to account for improvements on really important issues like children's mortality that you just said. It is absolutely unacceptable that in a world where we have antibiotics have been around for over 100 years, what would Alexander Fleming say if he knew how many thousands of children a year still die because they just can't get access to basic antibiotics? So on some areas, we absolutely need to hold ourselves to account for actually moving the needle forward in the right way. At the same time, I think, a vision for a desirable, fair future is always relevant. It's like a North Star, and especially helpful when you're blown off course with other changes, or blown off course because of the very dynamics of the world in which we're in, right? It's not when we're blown off course because people are like responding to democracy that doesn't seem to be delivering. And so they're suddenly flailing around looking for alternative options in a world where the system isn't doing what it says it was going to, and the social contract feels as if it's broken. We have huge amounts of migration, partly because of the vast inequality between countries, and also, which is getting worse, and also because of increasing impact of climate change. So these are not unconnected phenomena. And as Donella Meadows in Limits to Growth pointed out, with a very famous MIT study in the early 70s, these issues are all going to come together in the early 2020s, where demographic shifts towards the east of the world, where planetary resources are being consumed because we've got so many people on this planet, when values are shifting, when technology is developing, it's all going to create some kind of crisis moment. And so this is the moment that we're at. And needing a response that talks about what is that response that isn't about, well, let's just go for an authoritarian, oligarchic theocracy or kleptocracy, depending on where you sit in the world. That's not necessarily the only option. It's an response to, an increasingly constrained world where there may be conflicts around reducing resources, but there's also other alternative possibilities. And one of the most powerful possibilities is not, of which the seeds were in the Sustainable Development Goals story, is the Declaration on Future Generations that was signed by every single country unanimously in September, that coordinates and brings people together around this concept of the well-being of current and future generations and doing things in the here and the now with that kind of approach. So this is a long-winded way of saying that on the one hand, we need to be really clear about, holding ourselves to account on specific areas around parts per million on climate, looking at, biodiversity, looking at key indicators. But we also, at the same time, if we continue to have a North Star like the big picture SDG story or the Declaration on Future Generations that remains relevant over the next 20 years, then that's no bad thing either.
Yeah, so either way, I would say there's no escaping it. Everyone, we have to take some responsibility. um, and so, on a little bit touching on a little bit of the political side of the changes that are just happening drastically, some daily it seems, in the U.S. government. They're the leaving the World Health Organization, leaving the Paris Treaty, and the U.S. usually acts as the big brother in the world, and the big brother has gone off course, off, and maybe psycho, and so. So how do you think this latest move is? Are we just are we doomed, or do you think it's time for I guess people like change makers to rise up? Like I don't know. I think something has to happen.
Absolutely. And again, I think, it's a bit like the limits to growth point that I made just now. If you look at history books, I was just chatting to a friend of mine who's kid is just doing her history at the moment at the age of 15, and she's like, in all the books they say at some point in the post Second World War order, the US is going to end up not being able to or not willing to fulfill its role as global sheriff, as Eikenberry says, or the world's policeman, as others say, or the hegemonic power, or the person that it underpins the security architecture. That this moment we know was going to come. We didn't know when, but it was going to come at some point. And so the big question is, how, and the end that's happening now is extremely abrupt and extremely fast. It's certainly, we're not sleepwalking into anything. That's what I think the last 3 weeks have shown us. This isn't a kind of, in some ways, like 1930 to 1939 in Germany situation. This is, there's some really interesting memes that are coming out from the current US administration that says quite clearly where they're getting their inspiration from, in a way that nobody, I think, can actually be unclear as to what's inspiring their moves. Now, what does that mean? We are at a moment of liminality. Yes, that is a world vision that they have, that they're following. That's not the only possibility. I think that pulling out of the multilateral system in the way that it has, and overturning norms of cooperation, collaboration, respect, and for rule of law that has been in place for the past 70 or 80 years, although not always, quite frankly, believed. And that's not how the rest of the world always saw the American behavior. That's we need to underline that. But anyway, there's going to be some interesting second order effects. Is China going to lean in, for example, on the WHO around certain funding? What happens in terms of, African countries, although around debt, compromised with a lot of debt payments? What happens around that in terms of taking the lead on what's going to happen around certain health and education programs? I've just been talking to someone in Colombia today who does a lot of DEI work around trans indigenous representation in films. And, to a certain extent, it's like, well, we work with a lot of partners, not just American ones. And now we're going to find out who are really committed to this agenda of those other partners, and who just were involved because, American USAID was bankrolling programs. So there is something about, there's going to be second and third order effects that are going to be very interesting. And indeed, it also is the time and the space where different ideas that have been out and where change makers could really also come to the fore to shape a radical reimagining of what's going to be next. Because I don't believe that the worldview of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is actually held by a majority of Americans, nor certainly the world's population, especially if you kind of play it out over the next few years and decades, what that means for the well-being of people on planet. And the privilege of working in the area that I do is that, and back to the activation of this powerful phrase and principle of doing stuff now that's for the well-being of current and future generations. It's like most people, when you talk to them, they may disagree about the past, they may dislike each other in the present, but we all have a common interest in looking out for the well-being of our children and our children's children. And that is an amazing area for a coming together that is possible, and that I've seen work in places as different from, whether it's Algeria, whether it's the Lebanon, whether it's Uzbekistan, and difficult, really kind of conflict places, whether it's Cameroon, and having conversations about how do indigenous communities navigate the fact that we need to kind of extract primary commodities and minerals from the Congo Basin, which is, very much the lungs of the planet, together with the Amazon. What does it mean to kind of, balance these different questions? And by putting the different people, mining companies, governments, indigenous communities together to have those conversations about what can good look like out to 20 years and what might that mean that we do now. Those are really, really powerful processes that really deeply unlock new ideas and action. And the question then is, how do you then ensure that the governance mechanisms that we have that have been captured by often a minority of people, how do we make sure that governing mechanisms lock those insights in?
Yes, and you were, I was thinking, and this might sound strange, but I believe even though most people are not agreeing what is going on in the White House, it almost is the perfect time to do such a thing, because I think it makes people everywhere reflect to ask, who are we? And what I mean by that is, like, who are we as humans? And it sparks that, like, we have to make this decision now, because somebody else might be taking over and we won't be able to make decisions anymore for ourselves. And so I think it's the perfect time after the unfortunate lockdown, where people had lots of time to think, and then now a scary, like, overtake that it makes you have to, like, stand back and reflect and say, okay, am I going to, it's that I guess the moral standpoint, am I going to just let somebody run me over, or am I going to stand up for what I believe in, and I'm going to think about the bigger picture and not just me. And that's what it really
Absolutely.
And that's what it really means to be, as they say, human, right? And so that's
Absolutely.
the decision that has to be made. And my last question, because I know you have a hard stop, and I'm going to make this one a fun, hopefully easy one. What would you say is a project that makes you smile or so proud of your organization? Something that just made you like, wow.
Oh, so many. How can you even ask me that question? I am a big fan of that Stephen Jay Gould quote, which is like, I am less interested in the intricacies of Einstein's brain than the fact that there are millions of people like him that were probably born and died in the rice paddies of Bangladesh. So I think that there's something about, it's difficult to bring out one of all of them, but um, I am most proud of an amazing Futures Methods from Around the World project, which has got Elijah from, I think, Arizona, has got Pratiksha from India, has got Alice from New Zealand, has got Siddhi from India, and they're all using their own communities' views of the future. And often you're walking backwards into the future, or time is cyclical, right? Or time as kinship in different communities. And so they are kind of saying, how can we bring this power of coming together, which is a deeply political act with a small p, act of empowerment, a community coming together to discuss their own futures, good and bad, is a deeply powerful and empowering act. They're like, this is something that all communities all around the world should be able to have. And so they're doing all this kind of work to tap into the different mechanisms from all different communities and sharing it so everybody can do this. So that's the kind of thing that is hugely inspirational. But also, we've been doing work, for example, on intergenerational fairness, an assessment that helps a president in Portugal review the work that his government does and go, I want to champion future and current citizens, those rights. I'm going to say that's not doing enough for the future. So those kind of things I'm so proud of. The fact that we held a Building Hopeful Futures Festival in New York around the signing of the Declaration on Future Generations, bringing 150 people and 600 people globally, virtually, basically talking about all the work that they're doing, including Wales, where they have something called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's the 10th anniversary, and many people around the world, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Montana, whether it's Brazil, Cameroon, etc., they're beginning to learn, and politicians, officials, civil society, businesses, they're all going, this might be a way of actually being the change maker that I need to be. So that's why I'm happy and makes me really happy and excited. I do have some final thoughts on your point around the moment that we're in, if you're up for it.
Of course.
Yay. So I think that your point that like we need to be stand up, we need to stand up and be counted, I think is absolutely spot on. There is no official future now, right? The cozy view of like, oh, business as usual is clearly not there. So the big question I have for you and for people listening is, are you going to let someone else tell the story of your future for you? Or do you want to actually build the capability to actually tell the story of the future that you want to live in? Because if you don't, someone else is going to do it for you. And that's incredibly important. Now is the time where we need to kind of lean into and say, yes, we need to play a defensive game, but we also need to spend, even if it's 10% of our time and our energy and our resources, to kind of say, we can't just address the symptoms. We need to start building in this time of fungibility what the future can look like. And foresight essentially is a practice that whether you're a kind of technical person in an organization, or whether you're a community and social movement builder, or whether you're a political leader, it helps you have a practice of hospicing the old and midwifing the new, of like thinking about how things are declining and how things can emerge. And essentially what that means is three things finally. First is, so basically I'd just say reach out to us. We got amazing networks that you can connect to people near you or working in similar areas as you, including yourself, Annmarie, like the work that you've been doing, like leading this for the past 17 years with 60 podcasts it's like you're detecting signals of change. You are a change maker. And if you as well could kind of connect to that foresight practice, that would perhaps also give a language to talk about how change is happening. So if you're interested in being a good ancestor, if you're interested in supporting or connecting to the kind of people that I've mentioned, the really inspiring people using foresight in their communities, or if you just want to learn more about the foresight tools and approaches, just do always get in touch, because this is a hopeful practice that we need for quite challenging times.
Thank you, Cat, for your time and insight. To learn more about Cat Tully, go to soif.org.uk, spelled soif.org.uk. If you have a passion for an unserved community, a social justice problem, or want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.work to start your project of change today. Subscribe to our mailing list at projectgood.work/subscribe to get our episodes and blog articles sent to you each month. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we're focused on what matters.